streaming. Does that work? I'm on working question mark. Okay. Can you see us now? Oh, marvelous. Okay, I don't know. So we're going to start the recording again, and then we're going to go live there, Jason. And I hope you can continue with your thought. Unfortunately, I'm sorry about that.
Did you want me to pick up where I left off, or do you want me to
No,
repeat myself?
No, pick up where you were off. Hang on one second. Ready, set. There you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what I was saying is that about 10 years ago is when I got exposed to Git and GitHub as the successor to tools like Subversion and CVS. And what Git promised was a newer way of working with source control. And that is a decentralized or distributed model, which really just means that every repo that you work with is its own first-class citizen. There's no subordinate class versus a source of truth.
And you say repo, we're talking about repositories for everyone who's new to this.
Repositories.
Yes, and that's the general language of the industry. Comfortably calling it a repo would be understood by everyone?
Yes, for the most part, yeah.
Okay, great.
I mean, a repository is basically a collection of files and folders that are managed by source control.
Great.
And typically what you do is you would organize your repositories by application. So if you have a project or an application, whatever you're trying to deliver, all that would go into a single repository. Depending on how granular you want to get, you could even go further down to where each major component of a software delivery would be its own repository, depending on various characteristics and how granular teams want to get with it.
Right. And back in the day, is it fair to say that things like, I mean, I'm not a developer, but a Visual Studio was one of those types of source control tools?
Yeah, back in the day, Microsoft had a product called Visual Source Safe, or VSS. That was also a centralized tool. And so that was another one of those, I think back when VSS was a big tool, CVS was sort of the open source equivalent. And it really wasn't it was an okay tool, but it wasn't anywhere close to the level of robustness or enjoyed the level of support that some of the other commercial offerings had. And so back in that day, talking about 90s, then you would more likely use a proprietary source control tool like Visual Source Safe from Microsoft or any of the other tools like that, instead of using an open source tool like CVS, because it was generally looked upon as not capable of scaling to meet the demands of modern software development needs.
Yeah, and what changed? What was the moment of the aha moment? What I like to describe as an aha moment where there was a coming together. Was it the cloud? Was it predominance of one or more players that sort of began to make source control more standardized or more?
I would say that there's a number of things. I mean, back in 2005 was when the Git project actually started, and Linus Torvalds is the guy who wrote the original version of Git, and you may know him from the Linux kernel project. And so he wrote Git because the version control system that he had the Linux kernel project on at the time decided to change their terms, and they revoked the free access that he was enjoying for the Linux kernel project. And so and the system that he was on was actually a relatively early distributed version control system. And there really wasn't an open source or free tool that did the same thing. And so he had a motivation basically to develop a version control system that could meet the needs of the Linux kernel project, which had millions of lines of code around that was being worked on by at least 1,200 software engineers from around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not exactly a small project.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, being distributed around the world, there were some unique challenges that only decentralized systems could really achieve. And so he wanted to write something that could do that. And of course, he has a tendency of writing open source tools. And so within, I guess, 3 or 4 months, he came out with the first version of Git that he was then able to put the tool itself on. So it became a tool that you used Git to actually develop Git.
Mm-hmm.
And then he also then put the Linux kernel project on Git, one of the first projects to use Git.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a good stress test.
Mm-hmm.
He then handed over reins to another software engineer that then kind of took it from that point forward.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, a lot of the early decisions around like what the default branch is going to be, and a lot of the names and standards came out of those early days of Git, and it's just evolved out of that. So it went from not existing in 2005 to existing by the end of that year to becoming the dominant software, the dominant source control tool back in 2014.
Mm-hmm. And the evolution of this has gone from, I assume at the time it was not a cloud-based platform, that it was executable on a local computer that spoke to a cloud server of some sort?
Well, so that's one of the things that people get confused a lot on, and what is Git and what is GitHub?
Mm-hmm.
And Git itself is the source control tool. And so you have the Git commands and then any GUIs that go on top of that, graphical interfaces. That's the source control tool. And those tools live on your local machine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on top of that, or part of the Git ecosystem, are these cloud providers that provide hosting of Git repositories available on the internet. And those would be services like Bitbucket, GitLab, and GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could think of those as augmenting the baseline Git by providing external cloud access, as well as additional tools on top of that. So like GitHub provides things that make working with Git repositories easier.
Yeah.
But they're not necessarily core features of Git.
And those clouds are, whether it's Bitbucket or GitHub or others, those are both private and public, so they can be run on a public cloud, but it can also be run in private clouds?
So with public and private, there's two facets to that. One is the actual hosting service itself. So, for example, GitHub has a public offering at github.com, in which anyone could sign up for a free GitHub account and then start creating GitHub repos, which are basically just Git repos that just happen to be hosted on the internet. The repos themselves can be either public or private, depending on if you have proprietary content in them or not. The main difference there being that if on most of these services that offer free repos, there's a business model around that. And it used to be that GitHub would only allow free repos to paid accounts. But a couple of years ago, they opened it up, and that was the time when Microsoft acquired GitHub. When that happened, Microsoft opened up the free, allowed individuals to have free private repos. And where the business model came in was if you had a number of collaborators, that if you need to have people help you with a private repo, then you had to have a paid account. Now, the other side of that is that there is a flavor of GitHub that is installable within the enterprise or installable within corporate networks. And they call that GitHub Enterprise. And other Git hosting providers have equivalent type products. For example, Atlassian, who runs Bitbucket, I think they just renamed it, but it used to be called Stash. But now I think it's called Bitbucket Enterprise. And then the other one that's out there is called GitLab, which they have the GitLab community, which is a free version of the GitLab software that you can run on-prem or within your own private cloud. And then they have a paid equivalent of that, which I think they call GitLab Enterprise, in addition to their cloud-hosted offering at gitlab.com.
And are these fundamentally parallel offerings or similar offerings? Is there fundamentally anything, I mean, I'm sure there are feature functions that are different, but is that fundamentally do the same thing, provide the same feature functionality and scale from small to global enterprises?
And for the most part. Obviously, the enterprise products will have features that are oriented to enterprise management. For example, there's special APIs that are accessible to enterprise customers that allow them to manage their own enterprise distribution of the GitHub or whatever hosting provider software. But beyond those type of enterprise features, it's effectively the same product. They may be like a version or two behind because the enterprise offerings have a tendency of being a little bit more well tested. And so you're not going to deploy something to a Fortune 50 company that you want to do more testing for those customers. And so usually the enterprise flavor of their software is the hardened and really beaten down and ready to go for the enterprise version of what they publicly offer.
And what's to the extent what's the pricing model of, let's talk about Git and GitHub? What are the pricing models that don't have to come down to dollars and cents exactly, but are they affordable to the average small company as well as and they scale at reasonable rates, or do they become expensive fast?
Well,
depends on what you mean by expensive, right?
Well, yeah, you go there, and any website you go to where it says please contact a representative, you can kind of figure where that's going to go.
Right. Exactly.
And all the enterprise offerings, they have like one or two tiers where it's like they're okay publishing their rates online, but there's definitely, hey, if you have more than X number of users, hey, contact one of our sales reps and we'll talk to you about it.
Right.
So take it however you want.
That's an interesting
with that
open
regard.
interpretation. So
I mean, for the average small business, I would say that unless you have a compelling reason, just stick with the public offering, and just use the private teams and things like that, features of those products, and moving to your own copy of like GitHub Enterprise is really, I would say, unless you have like a very large distribution or you're very particular about security, or maybe you have very specific government or security compliance rules that you have to comply with, that you don't feel like can be addressed with any other approach.
Is there, so you're walking your way into Git and GitHub as a new user, what's the fundamental things that you need to understand, and what level of expertise do you need to have in order to become, a reasonably astute user, so that you're not so you can participate in a project? I mean, I guess maybe start with training. And what level of training do you need in order to have a fundamental working knowledge, so that you're not going to cause issues on any other GitHub project or product rollout?
Well, that's actually largely based on the team or the company that you are using Git and GitHub with. Because one of the great things about Git and GitHub is that it doesn't force any particular methodology on a particular project. Unlike some other tools in the past where there's an assumed way of working, or maybe a handful of established, agreed upon ways of working. Working with Git, it makes no assumptions. Basically, you have to have exactly one branch. That's the main branch, that or the default branch, and that's it. You can work directly off that one branch indefinitely. Or you can have a super complex system where there are different repos involved, there's review processes, a complex branching strategy, things of that nature. I will say that with Git, and that's true for any version control system, the more branches you add to the system, the more complex it gets, the more painful life becomes. It's just the way things are. Because you have multiple timelines that you're having to deal with, and trying to track changes between them. So really, my advice for people is to start simple and try to stay as simple for as long as possible. Don't overcomplicate your life unnecessarily. Don't try to seek after the perfect strategy, because the best strategy is the simplest strategy that works.
Describe a branch. Describe a branch, if you will.
Oh, sure. So a branch is simply for anyone who is familiar with any version control system in the last 40 years, it's probably familiar with the concept of a branch, and it's basically a timeline of changes. And so, and it works very much from a conceptual standpoint the same way on Git. There are some nuances, some things under the hood. The way that Git treats branches is differently than other source control tools, and that leads to some unique opportunities for how to manage branches and the corresponding workflows around them. But foundationally, it's from a conceptual standpoint about the same thing as anyone would expect, would be familiar with a branch from any other version control system.
And is the branch... Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to ask you a question about, maybe you can supplement this with, is the branch based on a feature and function set, or is it, obviously you're describing it as possibly within the entire product or platform or application you're building, but is it often, can it be broken up into feature and function sets within an application or a product?
It can be. The thing with Git is, as I mentioned before, is Git does not force any kind of methodology on the project. So you can decide that if you want to be a branch per release, or you could do a branch per feature, you could do a branch per day of the week. I mean, It doesn't matter. However you want to do your software development. I know some people that just don't do branches at all. They just the only thing that Git enforces is one branch. That is the main branch, the default branch. You have to have a timeline.
Correct.
And that's it. That's the only thing you have to have a timeline. Named timelines in Git are called branches. Therefore, you have to have at least one branch.
Right.
This is the same concept you would find in Subversion. The one branch in Subversion is called trunk. And if you want to create additional ones, you can, which you often do. But in Git, the default branch is currently called master, although the Git community is starting to make it easier to change what the default branch is named. And I think here in the next year, they're going to change it to call it main instead of master.
And is there, obviously, presumably there's a fair amount of strategy that will go into determining whether you take the main or master and turn it into multiple branches. Is there an overall approach that you recommend to thinking about those branches? Obviously, it's a very broad question because there's a zillion different potential applications for it. But when you think about this, and if you were to walk into a consulting client and say, what are we going to do? What's your general way of approaching this?
Well, as I mentioned before, as with any source control tool, the more branches you have, the more pain you're introducing to a system. Especially if you have any expectation at all of integrating these branches back into the default branch. The more branches you create, there are more opportunities for merges, and the more opportunities for merges, the more opportunities you have for conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want to minimize the number of branches that you have ongoing for any length of time.
Mm-hmm.
And so my main strategy is simply keep things as simple as possible, but still work.
Yep.
And so if you can get away with one branch, then great, do that. Just stay on the main or default branch, and life is good. Most of the time, that is not sufficient. Most projects are more complex that require at least a little bit of branching.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, you got to try to figure out what do you want to accomplish with branching. Do you want to have feature-based branches where each developer takes basically a private copy of a timeline, works on it on their own, and then integrates it back into the main or default branch when that feature or topic is complete? Or would you rather cut off of, have an unstable development on the main branch and then create more stable branches as we approach a release? And so that's kind of the release management oriented way of branching, where you say we're going to have release 1.1 and then release 1.2, etc. And these branches just live indefinitely and forever type of thing.
And is it really, is there any issue or any strategy that you recommend or have seen that relates to geographies? Let's say you have a team in Costa Rica and a team in the Philippines and a team in India and a team in Florida. Is that at all influence your strategy? And the reason I say that is just in terms of the 24/7 kind of development strategy, where you've got people that are handing off projects, handing off code to the next team, and so that they can, without affecting the main branch. Is there any value in that? Is that just not?
It depends. Well, I mean,
It
depends on how big your project is and how tight knit your team is.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I tell people is that no tool is going to overcome problems at the team level. So if you have poor communication with the team or low levels of trust within your team, no tool is going to solve that, including Git.
Mm-hmm.
So you gotta see how well does your team work. And so if there are communication challenges, then enforcing a particular policy or whatever is not going to solve that. With that, you can do feature-based branching, where you can say you take a feature and then maybe you have a collection of developers work on that feature. They could share a feature, or they can each have their own copy of the repo or the repository. And when you have your own copy of a repository, especially if it's on GitHub, this is a feature known as forking. And typically in a software development cycle, software development terms, the concept of forking is usually looked upon as a negative thing, except that in Git and GitHub, that's actually looked at as a positive thing, because everyone gets their own copy of the repository, from which they are able to create their own private feature branches, and then they can contribute these things back to the top level or team level repository. And so you can see these things. GitHub actually supports this thing that sits on top of Git. It's not a core feature, but it's something that a lot of Git hosting providers support, and that is pull requests. And so with what a pull request is it allows a developer to submit their branch for inclusion in the main development timeline. And so what that allows them to do is a pull request is basically online discussion with the attached desired changes. And so you have this, effectively it's communication back and forth, in which you can do, it's a combination of code review, chat, and other things around this code that is being has a consideration for being included in the main development of the project. And so you can do things like say, we will assign 1 or 2 people to do a code review. And then once they've reviewed it, they can accept the pull request, which would then merge in those changes into the main line of the development effort.
Mm-hmm. So it can really structure your rollout of feature and product and review as you in some sort of centralized fashion, for example, or distributed.
Yeah,
you can control it.
Yeah, it is. It's even though Git is distributed, I like to say it's centralized in denial in some respects, because it's developers still need to have a source of truth somewhere. And so what we end up doing is we elect a repository, typically one hosted on GitHub or a similar service, to be the golden copy, to be the source of truth. And even though everyone gets a copy of that repository, and each one of those repositories are first-class status citizens, they have all the history, they can even have their own set of branches independent of the repository which we've elected as the main or primary source of truth. Having your own copy with all the history allows you to get the additional benefit of being decentralized. But typically what happens is that with our own copies of those repos, we submit our own changes back to the team repository or the agreed upon central repository. And that's where we do our code reviews via pull requests.
Right. Okay. And then, but there is, and I assume in the let's say the public version of this, not the enterprise version, you can nominate and renominate and change the control process so that whoever makes the ultimate release decisions is truly in control of what the gold code is. That is to say, whatever goes live can be controlled from a fairly centralized, process-driven approach.
Yes, absolutely. GitHub supports a rather robust system of permissions. And so typically the person who creates the repo on GitHub is the initial owner of the repository. And of course that person has like the ultimate control. But then that person could then also assign various levels of control to other collaborators. And so these people, they add to a team of engineers, or a team of people who use GitHub for a particular repository. You could have people that simply have read-only access if it's a private repo. You can have people that can make changes, or they can submit changes via pull request, but they can't do anything else. And you can have people that basically have full access.
And what's the go ahead, I'm sorry. Continue, please.
Yeah, so there's various levels of access that you can grant to individuals or collaborators.
And is there, let's say, is there rollback features that enable slices of version 1.0, version 1.5, version 2.0 to be rolled back if there's a problem with any of these the branches that have been contributed? They thought they were what they wanted, and then they realized that they were not.
Well, so I guess there's a couple of parts to that. First of all, Git and GitHub, they are not CI/CD platforms, or they're not build platforms. So they aren't the ones that are going to be building code or deploying code. But depending on how you have a strategy around how you're going to use Git and GitHub, the way you use it can help facilitate rolling back code. For example, Git supports this notion of tagging commits. And so as you near major milestones within your software development process, you can say, hey, we're going to cut a release that's going to be our candidate release, and we're going to tag it as a candidate release. And then like later on, you say, okay, well, now we're going to tag this as our general release, our 1.0 product. And so a very common practice would be to use these tags to tag versions of the code base as of certain major milestones, certain versions. And so it's a very common thing to tag 1.0, 1.1, etc. And so if you find a problem with a particular version of the code, and as long as your engineers or the build platform that you're using has been consistent and diligent about tagging the code, then it is actually very easy to roll back those changes by simply targeting a known stable code base based on the tag to just roll back to.
So again, gets back to your point about communication in the team, coordination, having a similar kind of alignment of process.
And that comes back to Git and GitHub. It's just one piece of a greater DevOps tool set. And so you would want to marry that with a robust automation build platform. Something like Jenkins or Circle CI or Travis, or there are hundreds of them now, where it will build your code base whenever a change is detected. And then usually these automated systems would take care of the tagging for you based on some sort of criteria, like, are we doing a release build? If the build is successful, it passes all your quality checks, it's going to automatically tag that as a release build. Things like that. So while there's a lot that's wrapped up in using Git and GitHub, it's also part of a greater DevOps toolset.
You've got a variety of courses that you're running this coming week. We're streaming one of your courses. You've got deep knowledge, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people watching your courses online. What is the best thing for someone to do if they want to learn besides taking a course? Are there sandboxes that they can play in that show them how to avoid the mistakes that kind of people cause in a production environment?
Well, I mean, as far as Git and GitHub are concerned, the software development tools at the source control level are really more focused around the software development. And so avoiding production mistakes is really more about having a good discipline in software development practice. And so making sure that you tag your code appropriately, tag every major milestone that you can, so that you are capable of rolling back to a known stable point, or where to go and apply hot fixes, or make bug fixes that if you need to, knowing how your tool works, things like that. And so training around Git and GitHub and related tools, like part of the greater DevOps tool set, is definitely important. Depending on the amount of proficiency that one needs to have is largely dependent on how in-depth or how big your project is. But Git's not a terribly hard tool to learn, to be proficient in, as far as getting started. Probably the most challenging part of it is just getting over the fact that my approach is to teach from the command line first. And that does intimidate some people, because it seemed like that the command line was like the thing before the GUI was a thing. And then once GUI was a thing, like, everyone forgot that the command line even existed.
Right.
And then there's been this renaissance of the command line. So tools like Node.js and Ruby on Rails and things like that they're command line driven now. And so it's kind of funny but Git was developed as a command line tool for Linux. So all the power is in the command line. And there are GUI tools that sit on top of that. And they've gotten really good these days, but they effectively just hide all the details. In fact, a lot of times the GUI tools just run the command lines in the background for you.
Right.
So I always teach from the command line first, because it's best to know what your tools are doing,
right?
Instead of hiding those details. Because sometimes our GUI tools fail us, and we don't know why. Because we're clicking on buttons and we don't know what's actually happening.
Right.
Which is why I teach from the command line first. That way you know what's happening. And if you want to put a GUI on top of that, no problem.
Right. So once you understand the command line, you'll be able to work with most GUIs, but you can't do it the other way around.
Yeah, because once you learn a GUI, like a lot of people are stuck. Like they'll use Eclipse for their GUI for Git, and if someone else comes along with a different tool, they might be a little lost because they don't know which buttons to click on. Whereas if you have the command line, that's a universal tool. Like it's the command line always works the same way.
Right.
And what's great about the command line tools for Git is that the Git commands are all identical across all the platforms Git will be installed on. So whether it's Linux, Mac, or Windows, all the Git commands are identical, which is nice. You could even run them in the Windows command prompt or in a bash shell. Either way would be perfectly fine. All the commands are identical.
Okay. So that's pretty fundamental to the building process of how to understand these tools, the command line
and
functions.
It's also helpful when you're automating as well, because typically you're going to be working with command line tools when you're trying to automate stuff. So knowing how the command line tools work would lend itself to being able to automate certain processes. Like if you want to create a release process for your software development cycle, you can have a script that calls the Git commands to automate things like tagging and creating branches and things like that around whatever process you're trying to do.
Okay. Sounds like you've covered a lot in a short period of time. In terms of just think about it from a career building point of view, it seems like it would be fair to say that it's fairly fundamental to anyone's career to be very conversant in both Git and GitHub. That's fair.
I would say that 10 years ago, I would have said having exposure to some type of version control system was an important skill, perhaps even critical. Nowadays, I don't even say any version control system. I say you must know Git,
right?
Because it's the de facto standard now.
Right.
The Eclipse Foundation did a poll and found in 2014 that Git became the #1 source control tool used worldwide, and that rate has just continued to increase. Now it's like 90% of projects use Git or GitHub.
Right.
So it's no longer sufficient to have exposure to some type of version control system. Now, learning Git and GitHub, some type of learning the Git ecosystem in general is a critical software development skill.
That's foundational to entirely, probably every job in the software world.
Yeah, it's unusual now to see any other version control system specifically called out. It's almost always, when I look at job postings, is software engineer must have exposure to Git or GitHub.
So what's the toughest question you think someone's going to ask you as let's say a young developer or systems analyst? What's the toughest question, reasonable question, that someone's going to ask you in an interview about Git and GitHub? What's the zingers? I mean, if you have the top 2 or 3 zingers, what are the ones that really people should focus on, if there is such a thing? Because I imagine there are some senior developers who want to trip people up in an interview, and they say, "Well, do you know this?" So, what's the default? What's the tough questions that really cause, challenges in an interview, if there are such things?
I would advise people not to try to trip people up.
Right.
In interviews, I mean, the whole point is knowing Git and GitHub is a critical skill, but you don't have to have deep knowledge to be productive. So, if you're trying to ask, someone about some arcane, point of, is a branch really a branch, type of thing, you're asking the wrong questions. If you can just simply ask questions along the lines of, what are the foundational, features of Git and what are some advantages and disadvantages, things of that nature. That's a little bit better.
So pretty much just foundational understanding of how Git works, how GitHub works,
Right.
how repositories are shared, how branches are created, what some of the, as you've described here, some of the foundational benefits of creating, and as you said, I think quite clearly, simplifying, making sure that you don't overcomplicate for no reason whatsoever, or sort of for perceived advantages. Maybe having a standard before which you decide a branch is necessary.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're trying to study for an interview in which Git and GitHub questions will be featured, just knowing there are a handful of popular branching strategies that are worth at least understanding conceptually. There's something called Git Flow, which is a fairly popular branching strategy that works along the lines of your default branch is develop, which is unstable, and then the primary branch is really production, also called main or master. And then you can have like feature branches off that and release branches, whatever is required. But it's a very flexible way of working. And then there's another one where some people call it GitHub Flow. Some people call it the pull request workflow, where you use those. I've kind of described it already, where you use your own private feature branches and contribute that to the team repository as a pull request, and you work that way. So knowing these different ways of working conceptually are worth being aware of. But a lot of times, if you're a young software engineer, you're not going to have the luxury of proposing a way of working. You'll be dictated. This is how the software process works here. And everyone tries to reinvent the wheel effectively in that regard. So it's like, I know we have, there's Git Flow, but we have a better version here. In fact, I've encountered that with my day job, where I work for a major Central Florida company, a Fortune 50 company, and they effectively said, Git Flow is nice, but we can do it better. So it's like it wasn't invented here syndrome.
Right. But those two that you just described are fairly foundational to understanding, and as long as someone can describe the different strategies on some level, that's useful as knowledge of the process. And then to be, as you described, flexible about the people. In your case, working with a massive organization that has alternative implementation is not wrong. It's just different, and someone has to be able to be aware of what that is and communicate.
And that's a common software development thing, right? I've worked on large DevOps teams, and people will come to me and say, "Hey, why can't I do it my way?" And my response is to simply say that your way is one of 5 correct ways. We have to pick, 1 or 2, and then kind of standardize on that, because there is value in standardization to a certain degree. And usually that's okay. Sometimes they're disappointed that their way isn't one of the preferred ways of doing it. But it's not wrong. It's just different. And when you have 1,000 correct ways of doing things, that gets crazy. And so you have to pick, a handful of correct ways to do something. And so that everyone can get things done. Because if everyone just does their own thing, it's just chaos. And so the same thing with Git and GitHub, right? You need to know the foundational aspects of it. And then a lot of times, if you need to know more or know something very specific, the team that you go work on will train you there, or they will tell you how they want to use it, especially if you're starting out. You might need to know more deeper knowledge of something if you're a lead or a senior developer that is responsible for dictating or setting up the standards of the software development cycle and how they're managed the project. So then you might be responsible for saying what our established branching policy is going to be, and how we're going to interact with remote teams or different things like that.
Yeah, so more of a probing question and answer approach might be the best answer to, or The best answer to a question might be also, what's your strategy, and how do you think how is it handled within your organization? What's optimal for your organization?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So
and there are strategies that are more in alignment with with the more modern ways of delivering software. So, for example, people are familiar with the idea of waterfall development, where you have these longer processes which build up to an eventual release, which may be months or years in the making. Which is fine. It's worked fine for 40 years. But there's a more modern way of working where you take a more iterative approach. Something called Agile came out of the extreme programming phase or fad of the 90s, and it's really matured into a pretty disciplined way of delivering software on an iterative process. And so then having a branching strategy that is more in alignment with that way of working is definitely beneficial. And then we've even seen it taking Agile to new levels with something like continuous delivery or continuous deployment, where you are developing software with large automated testing suites to the point to where you could deploy to production with every change of code. Which scares the crap out of people that aren't familiar with that way of working. But if you have a complex branching strategy, you can't get to that because the more branches you have, the more complexity you have. It's not a very conducive way to getting to continuous delivery. And so if you can consolidate your branches, less is more in this case. If that's what your ultimate goal is, then that's going to very much dictate the kind of branching strategy you implement if you're trying to achieve continuous delivery or continuous deployment.
Yeah, I imagine CI/CD is fundamental to the ultimate approach that you take to Git and GitHub, where you are in that process.
Right.
Yeah.
But some companies just aren't ready for that or don't have any plans to go down that route. So having a more complicated branching strategy that's more conducive with older Agile or waterfall approaches is fine.
Yeah. Okay. But as things get faster and faster and applications become more interoperable and speaking to each other, the strategy is we'll call it the Julia Child strategy of reduce, 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 right? Simplify, make it more streamlined and easier to manage.
Right. Less is more.
Less is more. That's a good way to end this. Jason, thank you very much for excellent insights, and everyone look forward to Jason's course coming out in the next week on our Starweaver platform. Thanks for your time, Jason.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.